My grandmother has been severely ill my whole life. She has smoked cigarettes for over 50 years and is still a heavy smoker. She was diagnosed with a bad case of COPD at a fairly young age before I was even born, but she never stopped smoking. I am a 20-year-old man now, and my grandma is still alive, even though she has suffered multiple heart attacks and strokes and been diagnosed with coronary artery disease and lung cancer. I remember my mom explaining to me that grandma is very sick and will die soon when I was just a little kid. All my life, she's been either sitting in a wheelchair or on the couch, or walking extremely slowly with a rollator. The only times she stands up during the day are the moments when she goes to the balcony for a cigarette, or needs to use the bathroom. In both of these situations, she almost always needs help from my grandfather too. She's often very grumpy and you rarely see her smile. I've always liked to think that she's grumpy and annoyed, only because of her illnesses, and I've never saw her as a mean or bad person. She had a habit of giving me and my siblings some pocket money every Friday, on the condition that we had acted right and fulfilled our responsibilities like school or housework. We lived only a mile away from my grandparents, and my school was right next to their house. I could even see their backyard on my break time, and sometimes my grandfather was there doing some yard work and waving at me. I normally went on to pick up my weekly pocket change right after school on Fridays, and the typical meeting was very quick and quiet. I knocked on the door and waited for my grandpa to come and slowly open the door. He always opened it just a little bit. Softly, he said hello and pushed his hand through the door gap. I took the money, thanked him, and at that point the door was already almost closed. Usually the visit was just that short, but sometimes Grandma wanted to come see me quickly, and walked very slowly to the door with her rollator. I remember the typical situations where I only met my grandpa at the door, and tried to view Grandma from the little gap that was open. It always looked dark, shadowy, and quiet inside, and I thought that Grandma is probably taking a nap. I liked the tradition of getting to meet my grandparents every Friday, and it was always a nice start for my weekend. But then, one Friday afternoon, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, and going to pick up my money, something very weird happened, and that sight still gives me chills and deep anxiety. It was a sunny autumn day, and I got out of school a bit earlier than usual. I took my bicycle out of the bike stand and headed to my grandparents' house. Like I said, it was a little earlier than usual, so they weren't waiting for me yet. I went on to knock on their door, but no one came to open it. I waited for a moment, but still no one came. I was about to leave and thought no one was home, until I heard some noises from the inside. I thought they just didn't hear my first knock, and knocked again, a bit harder than last time. It still took a while, but finally, the door opened, even less than normally. It was dark. I could only see the fuzzy figure of my grandpa, who didn't even say hello this time. He just gave me the money and whispered that Grandma was sleeping, because we were not expecting you to come yet. At this point, the door gap was a bit bigger, so I could see into their living room where there was some kind of dim light. I was a little ashamed about my sudden visit, and decided to whisper back that I was sorry and my school just ended early today. Before I could say anything, I heard intensifying footsteps coming out of the living room, and immediately after saw my grandmother running through the living room in a weird, creepy, and unnatural looking forward bent posture, not moving her arms at all. I looked there for probably half a second, but I was so terrified it felt like a minute. Grandpa just slammed the door shut in front of my face, and I stayed behind the door, almost shaking from the fear and shock. So many thoughts in my head. How can Grandma move so fast? She is very ill and can't even walk without support. Why did Grandpa lie about her nap, and what the hell was that? As I started to walk away to get my bike and leave, I calmed down and thought that maybe she wasn't moving that fast, or Mom has exaggerated her bad condition. I didn't even really believe those explanations. I just had to get some logical reason for that to calm down. I walked over the grass to get my bike that was parked right under my grandparents' bedroom. I hopped on it and took a quick look through the window that was right next to my face. What I saw next still haunts me, and even after all these years, I find it hard to think of and explain. My grandma staring straight at me with big, wide-open eyes and a deranged smile. She didn't even look like my grandma. Or she did, but the expression was something my grandma would never do with her face. She looked similar to the Momo face that roamed the internet a couple of years ago. She seemed to be sitting or squatting on the floor, cause her face was on the lower edge of the window. I was instantly terrified by the thought of her being there, stalking me with that disturbing face. While I stood there calming down, and was slowly starting to leave, I remember hiding my fear and responding to her stare with a little smile, but she didn't react at all. Then my grandpa ran behind her and closed the curtains. I cycled home fast and told my mom the whole story, which she basically just ignored, thinking I over-exaggerated her speed. She couldn't understand why I was scared of her looking at me from the window. But she wasn't there. My grandma wasn't looking at me. She was stalking at me. After that day, I didn't want to get my pocket money for the weeks. As time passed, I started to go visit them. First with my mother, and later alone again. Grandma was always like I remembered. She can't even walk without support. No one ever mentioned anything about that day, and my grandparents were asking why I suddenly stopped visiting on Fridays. I know my grandpa remembers that, but I've always been too scared to ask. I kinda just wanted to forget the whole thing, and spend as much time with my grandparents as possible. But I will never forget that day. My terminally ill grandmother ran like a child, and stalked me through the window like a psychopath. What was that?
I'm a park ranger at a national park. I won't say which one, but if you've been here before you might recognize it based on the description. I used to give tours in the large, sprawling cave that makes up one of the main features of our park, but a week ago, we had an incident occur which led us to close it indefinitely. I was there that night, and I know the reason why. I always count the people in my tour group through the tour, even more frequently on the tour I was giving that day, where it's a bit more strenuous and goes through the undeveloped portions of the cave. Since it sort of acts as a 4-hour introduction to caving, you tend to get the more adventurous sorts. Most people are respectful, responsible, and careful, but as always, there are some exceptions. You'd think it'd be common sense to not wander off alone in a dark cave, but you'd be surprised. For example, I had one guy yell at me recently when I tried to prevent him from wandering off away from the group. He told me he could handle it. He had been hiking for years and he had a satellite phone, so he'd be fine. I decided it wasn't worth arguing with him about how satellite phones won't work 200 feet below ground. So I just heavily implied that leaving the tour group would result in a permanent ban from every park in the country. It's not true, but it kept him safe and with the group. I was also especially focused because starting that day, The tour route bypassed one of the usual tunnels, which was closed for conservation efforts, and took a detour through an area that hadn't been on the tour route for years. Anyways, back to counting the group. We limit this tour to 10 people, and we make sure there are no overlapping tours that follow the same route. In addition to making sure we don't lose anyone, it helps prevent people from either mistakenly or intentionally joining a different tour group than the one they started with, preventing a potentially dangerous and expensive search and rescue operation for a missing person that's not really missing. I had a full group, it was the last tour of the day, and it was going really well at first. I had some repeat attendees that I recognized. Everyone was careful, paid attention, and asked good questions. The whole group stuck with me at all times. When we went through the detour section, the smell hit me, earthy but with an undertone of decay. There was an intersection on that path that forked off far into the darkness, and the smell seemed stronger down there, which made me really uncomfortable. I let everyone go ahead of me to stop in the next, more open space, because something about that place gave me a really bad feeling. I counted the one person who had somehow managed to end up behind me, and then sighed in relief. We had all 11 people. That wasn't right, I should only have 10. Or maybe it was. I suddenly felt my confusion and concern melt away, so I shrugged and moved onwards. The rest of the tour went great, until we were almost done and approaching the elevators. We lost power. We had our headlamps, so we weren't in absolute blackness, but it was still jarring to be unexpectedly thrown into darkness in the part of the cave that usually has full lighting. Luckily, the backup generator came on in under a minute. We have some pretty intense thunderstorms up here, and although this had never happened to me while I was on a tour, it had happened to a couple of fellow rangers. The issue, though, is that neither elevator seemed to work even after the generator turned on. I pushed the button, but nothing happened. The natural cave entrance is too small for most people to fit through, so the elevators were the only feasible way in and out. I wasn't too panicked at that point yet. The elevator area was one of the few areas in the cave where you could actually make and receive phone calls. We have phone line laid there for that very reason. I made a call to upstairs, I let them know about the issue, and did my best to calm the group down while I told them the plan. Everyone was dressed warmly enough to be able to withstand the 50-ish degree weather for a while longer. We don't allow food or drinks in the cave, but I was hoping we'd be out before that it became an issue. It's funny, I have always worried about losing someone, but since we have no overlapping tours, I'd never even given a thought to what I'd do if I ended up with an extra person. So, when there were 12 people when I turned around to do a count again, I was a bit at a loss of what to do. I counted multiple times, and it was more apparent that we had 2 more people in our group now than we came in with. Did you lose your group? I asked broadly, waiting hopefully for 2 people to speak up and say yes, they got separated and joined us, but they all stared at me in silence. I searched the faces of the people that I'd spent the past 4 hours with, and there wasn't anyone that seemed new. Everyone I looked at, I felt like I could remember their name, and walking with them for the past few hours. Maybe I was losing it, I thought at the time. Maybe we'd made an exception. After a while, I called upstairs for an update. They were going to try and get at least some sort of emergency fix in to get everyone out. They expected it to be at least another hour or so. I turned around and filled the group in. There was a bit of the chorus of sighs and groans I had been expecting, but there was also something else. A 13th person, hovering at the edge of the group. Before I had time to even fully process that development, one of my tour members suddenly darted away from the group clustered at the elevators, and she ran back into the darkness of the cave. I dug out my spare elevator key. You have to have a key to operate these, so no one can go up or down without a ranger. Handed it to one of my repeat attendees I knew I could trust, and ran after her. I shouted back at the others to stay put and monitor the phone, and to go up without me if needed. I tried to keep her in my light, but she was so nimble. She ducked, weaved, and navigated like an expert. I struggled to keep up even in the portions of the trail I frequented almost daily. I was seriously worried for her safety. No matter how familiar you are with the area, running through a cave, much less in the dark, is never safe. I wouldn't have been running myself if I didn't need to in order to keep up with her. Suddenly, she was gone, and I realized I was somewhere I hadn't been before. I was approaching a wall with just a small crevice that opened to the other side. I didn't see her in it, or anywhere else for that matter. It was as if she had become one with the darkness itself. That was when it first hit me. She had no headlamp, helmet, knee pads, or shoes. How the hell did I not notice that when I was looking over the group for outliers? I looked around frantically as the fear of her being potentially lost deep within the part of the cave that I was less familiar with sunk in. Just as I was debating my next move, I saw her again. She had somehow ended up in between me and the way I had come. She was far enough away from me that she was partially hidden in the shadows. My relief was short-lived though, when I realized for the first time that her eyes reflected in the dim light a reddish-orange hue, like an animal's, like something that evolved in the dark. Fear turned into dread and I instinctively moved as if to back away as she approached, but after a step back, I was against the wall. I felt for the crevice and tried to slowly walk sideways against the wall so it was behind me. There was nowhere else to go and I hoped I'd fit. As she emerged further into my light, I noticed features that I somehow hadn't caught before. Her mouth was too wide, her eyes were small and perfectly round with wide pupils. What I had before interpreted as loose-fitting caving clothes were layers drooping flesh upon closer scrutiny. What I was looking at was not a person at all. Seriously, how had I not noticed before now? Minutes ago I could have sworn this was a youngish girl with mousy brown hair that I'd been walking around with her for hours, known her by name. Her name was... I realized I couldn't remember. It lunged at me and I did the best thing I could think of at the time. I shoved myself sideways as far into the crevice as I could go. It managed to take a decent-sized chunk out of my arm and I squeezed myself in further. Eventually it hissed and faded back into the darkness. I had a brief moment of reprieve where the panic faded. I carefully focused on trying to squeeze back out, holding my breath, trying to shrink my profile. That's when I realized I could distinctly hear something else breathing behind me, on the other side. Suddenly, I was being pulled backwards by something. It was tearing into my jacket and the arm that was pinned behind me, but the opening was too thin. Eventually, it appeared to give up and the only breathing I could hear was my own. I tried to take a deep breath and for the first time realized just how tight the rock was around me. I couldn't even fill my lungs. What I had just encountered was quickly becoming a close runner-up, but this was my literal worst nightmare. How long would it be until someone could find me, much less help me? I tried not to focus on thoughts of dying, wedged here in the darkness. Each shallowed, panicked breath just served to remind me of how tightly I was stuck. I reminded myself that panicking wouldn't help. I just had to focus on getting out. It took what felt like an eternity to squeeze back out. By then, whatever was hunting me appeared to be long gone. I had a slew of cuts and abrasions both from the rocks and the creature, but the slick blood from the injuries had at least aided me in sliding out. It took me longer to walk back, much longer, as I crawled, ducked, and stepped back, stiff, bloody, and exhausted. I was worried about my group. I was tempted to call out, to let my group know I was on my way, to warn them, but I was hesitant to draw any attention to my location, or possibly have anyone from the group stray from the others to try and find me. Whatever the creature was, it seemed unwilling or unable to attack all of us at once, so I held on to the hope that they stayed together. As I approached, I heard the sounds eating off in the distance. It was hard to gauge from where, but I could hear the aggressive smacking and chewing of someone long hungry. I sighed. I wasn't looking forward to having that "you aren't supposed to bring food in here" conversation with a group that was already hungry, tired, and unhappy from having had been stuck in a cave for hours. I decided that as long as they were safe, I'd just deal with the repercussions and clean up without saying a word. I heard the phone ringing in the distance. It continued to echo, unanswered. By the time I got to the elevator, they were all gone. I called to them, but got no response. I pressed the button and could hear the elevator moving. I tried to wait to check upstairs before panicking. They'd probably already gone up. From the elevator, I took a last look into the darkness as the doors closed. Multiple pairs of red-orange eyes reflected the lights from my headlamp far in the distance. I suddenly panicked at the thought of if they could figure out how to use the elevator. I pictured them hunting our hikers on secluded trails or through the small town outside of the park. But I calmed myself, remembering no, they'd need a key. As the elevator rose, I tried working out in my mind how the hell I'd explain that we needed to close the trails to my supervisor without sounding insane. When I came up the elevator, my coworkers and supervisor were waiting. From the moment the doors opened, they fretted over my injuries and told me they were worried when the tour group came up without me, and were working on sending an initial response team to search for me. So the whole group made it out okay. I confirmed. I needed to hear it. You did great. Everyone's safe and accounted for. They were in good shape, so we sent them home a while ago. My supervisor smiled. All 16 of them.